Welcome to our first Exodus study. These office studies. We've done Exodus years ago, probably I think went back 10 years ago, and we have some audio recordings that are online. But we finished Genesis doing these office studies, and now we're going to get right into the book of Exodus. And I want my first hillbilly holler. If you haven't seen any of these studies, we start our studies with a hillbilly holler out to somebody that we appreciate, who most of the time it's somebody who is listening to these studies and have contacted us. But in this case, Grandpa Greg wants to give a hillbilly holler out to my grandbabies. So far, in age order, we have, well, I'll do it in a different order than age. Caroline is the oldest. Samuel, Lydia, and Gloria. Those first three belong to one set of parents. Gloria belongs to another. And they're too young to really listen to these right now. But if the Lord tarries, one of these days they turn Grandpa's Bible studies on, I want them to know I love them and think about them and thought enough about them to give them a hillbilly holla. Now, I don't look like a hillbilly with this hat on, but you know, hillbillies, it's from where your heart is more than anything. People in our Genesis studies, and I'm sure you'll see it in these Exodus studies, say things about my shirts, because a lot of times I'll be wearing Hawaiian prints, and that's not really hillbilly attire. But you know, if a hillbilly goes to the beach, I'm sure he puts on some Hawaiian shirts. And well, when a hillbilly goes bald, he wears hats. And I'm forehead bald. I'm clean, according to the law. But I'm going to wear these hats from time to time because I just like wearing hats. And we're trying to keep these studies casual. We're not trying to get too serious with them. Every once in a while, something will get under my craw, and I went back and watched some of the old Genesis studies, and every once in a while I can get all, you know. But that's because I'm human and I'm a preacher. But most of the time, we're just going to study the book just like this, and we're always going to start with a word of prayer. So let's pray. Father, we thank you for another opportunity to study another book. Finishing Genesis, and with all the other books we've studied in our church meetings, and now to begin an office study in the book of Exodus, knowing that there are literally thousands of people watching these studies over a period of weeks, and then listening, thousands hear it on the radio, bbfohio.com, and we're just thankful for all those we've heard from. Lord, you'll continue to teach the book, and that they'll continue to learn, and you'll help me to teach, to be the guide, humanly speaking, but to allow your Holy Spirit to be our guide, all of us, including me, as we go through your book, studying your word, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we pick up after our study with Genesis. I just want to encourage you, if you've jumped in with us right here in Exodus and you didn't follow along in Genesis, I would really encourage you to go back and go through Genesis with us as well. And we left off with Joseph in a coffin. And 300 years have passed as we begin Exodus chapter 1. And then we'll make a couple of leaps as we go through Exodus. Following the life of Moses, you go from the beginning of the book, and then, we leap ahead to the birth of Moses, and then we leap ahead to he's an adult, and then we leap 40 years after he's exiled, he comes back, and then we go 40 years in the wilderness. A lot of 40s. And this is also 400 years after Jacob and his sons, who remained, minus Joseph, migrated to Egypt. And it's 430 years since the time that God called Abraham out of Ur. And the reason I bring that up is because the skeptics and people, excuse me, you'll hear them, even claim it's like an error or it's a mistake. And then some well-meaning people say, well, it was a gloss by a overzealous scribe or a careless scribe or something. And it's hogwash. Galatians 3:16 and 17 confirms what we're going to read in Exodus 12:40, that the sojourn of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And that's what it says in Galatians 3:16, 17. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ. And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of no effect. But then you read over in Genesis 15:13, where God's talking to Abram, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, that's talking about Egypt, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And it's not a contradiction, and we always say the most important thing when you start studying the Bible is the three rules, the three main rules, the three most important rules are context, context, context. And if you look at the context in Genesis 15, that is when God is actually prophesying about the Exodus, or the giving of the law. Excuse me. And in Galatians 3, it's confirming what we will read in Exodus 12. That is talking about the time, counting from the time God called Abraham out of Ur. See, it's two different things. God called Abraham out of Ur. Now, how many years was it from then to the giving of the law in the Exodus, which we'll see happen pretty closely together in human terms? It was 430 years. But from the time in Genesis 15 that God prophesied the fulfillment of that event, that was 30 years later, and so it's only 400 years. And we'll discuss, there'll be 2 or 3 other times we'll discuss things like that as we go through Exodus. The main rule is stick with the book. Anybody accuses the Bible of having errors and contradictions, just ignore them. But I mean, ignore them to the extent don't let them call your faith in the Word of God into question. There are answers, even if you can't find it on your own. That doesn't mean anything. None of us are, super saints. None of us are biblical Einsteins or Teslas. And so we need help a lot of times. There's nothing wrong with seeking help and asking for help. The answer is out there. And of course, feel free to send us questions at bbfohio@yahoo.com, or go to our website, bbfohio.com, and use the email button there. Now, Exodus is the second book of Moses, of the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the Torah, the Pentateuch. They're called by both names. They're called the books of Moses. Exodus is the second book. Now, Genesis was written, it all took place before Moses was born, and it was written, I believe, by various authors, which could include Adam, could include Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Any or all of them could have contributed. Then Moses took all that, and he's basically the general editor of the book of Genesis. Now, there are some who I've heard in the past anyway to say, "Oh, I believe that God gave Moses every word," and well, I believe that too. But I believe He gave it to him in the form of what the previous patriarchs had written, and then as general editor, he puts together. And we'll see, especially at the end of Deuteronomy, part of that book's written after Moses is dead. So who wrote that? Well, I believe it was most likely it was Joshua. But the point is, God gave us these books of Moses, and they are infallible. And that's the most important thing to get. Now, we're told that Moses wrote the book of Exodus in Exodus. We'll see in chapter 24, 3 and 4. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord hath said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel, and so forth. Now there's another place where it talks about him basically etching in stone the words of the law, the 10 Commandments. But here is a reference to him writing more than just that, writing the words of the Lord, and of course I believe that it would include everything we see in Exodus. And Jesus confirms this. It's not just guesswork here. Mark chapter 12 verses 26 and 27, and Jesus is speaking and says, as touching the dead that they rise, have ye not read in the book of Moses how in the bush God spake unto him, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Ye therefore do greatly err. So Jesus is proving the resurrection from the writings of Moses, and he quotes directly Exodus. We'll see when we get there. Exodus chapter 3 verses 1 through 6. And he says it's the book of Moses. Now, the people who say, well, he just was using the language and understanding of the day. Well, that would make Jesus a liar. If Jesus knew better and it wasn't Moses, and he let people believe it was the book of Moses, Jesus would have been party to a lie. And we know Jesus didn't lie. Jesus was sinless, is sinless, never has sinned, never will sin. And so those kind of, sometimes from well-meaning people, trying to make the Bible fit the culture and go along with the scholars and all that kind of nonsense, you're always going to get in trouble if you try to do that. And we won't. By the way, there's 40 chapters, and if before you get into a study of the book of Exodus, I highly suggest you read it. And I always tell folks, I don't try to boast about how many times I've read through books, but I've been through Exodus a number of times. As I said, I taught through it 10 years ago. I had taught kind of an overview before that, and I've done numerous studies in and around and about Exodus over the years. But if you'd like, you can read the Bible in 5 days. Just read the book of Exodus in 5 days by reading 8 chapters a day. And in 5 days, you'll have read through the book of Exodus if you do 8 chapters a day. Of course, you could read the whole thing in a day if you want, or however you see fit, but that's just one plan that I think is doable. One of the things I've tried to do over the years is just help people think through how they can do things. I had a fellow say, he really had a short attention span, and by the time he'd get through the 3 chapters a day, he felt like he hadn't paid attention to a lot of it. I said, well, start reading 1 chapter at breakfast, before or after, whenever, 1 chapter at lunch, around lunch, and the 3rd chapter around dinner or before you go to bed. And he started doing that and came back and said, that's been great. I actually remember everything I'm reading now. So whatever it takes, all of us are different. The Bible doesn't say thou shalt do this or that when it comes to reading the Bible. It just tells us to read the Bible daily. It's our daily bread. We should study to show ourselves approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth, 2 Timothy 2:15. Jesus said in Matthew 4:4 that we should not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. And so forth and so on. Read Psalm 119 if you need to know why we should hold the Bible in such high regard and study it so intently. So as we get into the book, we are going to start. This is an introduction I'm giving right now, but we're going to get into the text and get started. And the word Exodus, as you'll see, is not, or as we'll mention, is not the title given in the Masoretic Hebrew text, but in our King James Bible it's called Exodus. It means going out. Of course, that's exactly how we use that word today. If there's an exodus, it's people going out, leaving. There's a claim that Christians are starting to exodus out of Facebook and Twitter because of the way they are abusing people. And by the time you watch this, that may have already happened. I hope it does. I've left Facebook and Twitter, where Bible Believers Fellowship isn't on there anymore. But that's an example. That ought to happen. There ought to be an exodus. Anytime, if it's a voluntary association and you cannot be what you ought to be as a Christian, then you need to get out of it. And that would be an exodus. And the whole book was written during Moses' lifetime, and that's important. I think it helps if you understand that as we study. And we'll discuss this as we go on through the study, but I just want to mention that the scholarly consensus, as it's called, the majority of scholars, so-called, relegate Moses to legendary status and not a real historical character. Now, they try to do that with Jesus in some segments of the so-called scholarly community. But all that means is they don't believe the Bible, and because they haven't found any hardcore evidence for Moses outside of the Bible, then they say, he never existed. But they keep pulling that, and they keep getting bit by that same snake over and over. They did that with Tyre and the city of Tyre. They did that with Nineveh. They did it with the kingdom of Assyria. At one time, the seminaries in the liberal Ivy League type schools back in the early 20th century were telling their students Assyria was a fictitious kingdom. They tried to do that with King David. Now we've started finding evidence for him. It's just, again, scholars, it really bothers me when I hear some teachers that I respect otherwise, and they'll say, well, scholars this and scholars that, and according to the scholars, like there's some kind of authority. And the Bible, they're called scribes in the Bible. That's what you call a scholar, scribe in the Bible. And they even said the people were shocked by Jesus because he taught as one with authority, not as the scribes. And so don't be a scribe, and don't pay attention to the scribes. I got a little saying I'll probably repeat from time to time. When in doubt, leave the scholars out and stick with the book. And along those lines, I do have to mention then the dates. Scholars try to date these things, and I think it's very likely, it looks very likely, that this book happened somewhere in between 1600 and 1500 BC. Now, not taking anything for granted, some of you may not really understand the whole BC thing. In AD, every year the number goes up. But when you're dating things in BC, as you come down history, it gets smaller. And so it's like you go from around 4000 BC, you have the fall and the beginning of human history, and it gets smaller and smaller until Jesus shows up, and that's when they split time. And BC means before Christ, and AD is Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord. And then it starts counting upward. And the time we're recording this is 2018. And the book of Exodus, if you can think of it, picture it in your mind, happened 1500 to 1600 years before Christ. You might see other dates other places, even among good men. And I'm just telling you, no one really knows for sure, but I think that's the safest thing to, at least to give you some idea where you're at. You know, it's just good to know where you're at. It's like being in a store and you don't know where you're at, and you're thinking, I'm looking for the fish hooks and I'm not seeing them anywhere. And then you go up to the guy who works there and you ask where the fish hooks are. If they don't have their aisles numbered, and I've been in stores like that, it's a pain. But if they can say, go down to aisle 12 and turn right, there it is. And so that's kind of the way we look at the Bible. I'm glad we have chapters and verses, but it's not always, the Bible's not given in chronological order in the Old Testament. So you got to be careful to pay attention to where you are when you're reading. So we'll get into the Shemot. That's what it's called in the Masoretic text, because they used the first few words of Exodus 1:1. Let's read that. Now these are the names. That's Shemot. That's where the Hebrew name of the book comes from. Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man and his household came with Jacob. And so this, verse 1, we start right off with a reminder of the whole incident with Joseph and how that his brothers sold him into slavery. He went down into Egypt, and after going through some trials with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife being thrown into prison, and then the baker and the you know what, it always messes me up because of that story of the baker and the candlestick maker. But well, I've got to look that up. Who was it with the baker? See, I've got fallible recall here I have to deal with. It was the butler. I should think of Clue, because in Clue the butler always did it. So the butler and the baker have the dream, and Joseph is able to tell them both what their dream is, and they, on the third day after he told them that the dream, then Pharaoh had a birthday, and they had a big party, and it didn't work out good for the baker. He got hung, and the Jehovah's Witnesses used that and the killing of John the Baptist to condemn those of us who have birthday parties. That's not the point of the story. That's a ridiculous abuse of the Bible. But the point is that Joseph then was later elevated, because the butler was able to tell Pharaoh when he had his dream of the 7 kine that were healthy and everything, and then the 7 kine that were skinny and emaciated, and he was able to tell them that means there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Let's store up all the food and get ready for the famine, and they did that. So Joseph, giving them that interpretation, helped them to prepare for the famine and saved Egypt from total destruction. So Joseph becomes the right-hand man, kind of like Daniel was in Babylon, the president of Egypt, or the prime minister of Egypt. And so then when Jacob and his sons come down into Egypt, that's what we're reading about here. That's what the reference is to. And most of you know that. But it is a reminder also, because it refers to the children of Israel, and then it says his household came with Jacob. That's a reminder that Jacob, the supplanter, was eventually, God kind of got him right and renamed him Israel. He wrestles with God and gets renamed. So we see these sons named then, in beginning in verse 2. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Verse 3, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. Verse 4, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. And this lists the patriarchs. These were men whose names at this point begin to be used to identify their offspring. The 12 tribes, each of their offspring, their descendants, are named, their tribe is named after one of these men, the patriarchs. And that's the way we see from this point on most of the time. You'll see them referred to that way. And just to understand this battle that we're seeing isn't just a story of a family and their struggles to survive. This is the story of Satan trying to destroy the seed that would come from Adam on down through Noah and Shem and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Judah. And at each point, as each one of this next step in the genealogy towards Jesus, it kind of breaks off, and the others are looked at with less intensity, and God focuses in on the one that he's going to bring the Messiah from. And Satan wants to destroy each one of those. So keep that in mind. It really makes the Bible come to life if you see these things and you see all these attempts. And it explains Satan's desire, as we're going to see coming up in the next study, where he tries to kill the Jews and kill the firstborn. And it also explains everything right up through the Holocaust and anti-Semitism today. So verse 5 says, "And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already." Now, this is a big deal for some people, because all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. It's a direct reference then to Genesis 46, 26, and 27 that says, "All the souls that came with Jacob into Egypt, which came out of his loins, beside Jacob's sons' wives, all the sons were 66. Not a contradiction. "And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. So there, it's confirmed that the number is 70. But in verse 26, you're subtracting Jacob, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh, and you have 66 souls. Verse 27, you add those back in, you have 70. Then in Deuteronomy 10:22, it's confirmed, "Thy fathers went down into Egypt with 70 persons." That's 70. But then you go over to Acts 7:14, and Stephen's basically his last word in Testament, last sermon he preaches before he's killed. And it says, "Then sent Joseph and called his father Jacob to him and all his kindred, 75 souls." So it's 75. But if you look closely, you'll see that this excludes Joseph, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Jacob, and is the total of all his kindred, which were 75 souls if you count the wives in this count. In the previous count, it said it didn't count the wives. And that would be minus Judah's wife, Shua, who is dead, and then we believe Simeon's wife was also dead, which is why he had Sheol, the son of a Canaanitish woman. And the references there are Genesis 38:12, Genesis 46:10, but that leaves all of his kindred as 9 wives plus 66, which comes to 75 in Acts 7:14. It's not a contradiction, and as I said earlier, when in doubt, leave the scholars out and stick with the book. And we're going to pick up with verse 6 next time, where the verse 6 says, "And Joseph died and all his brethren and all that generation." So the Genesis crew is out, and we come with a new generation as we start our second study next time in the book of Exodus.